This is lecture 3 of chapter 17, and we are picking up now talking about energy and chemical flow in ecosystems. We're going to start with energy and how energy moves through organisms in an ecosystem. And then after that, we will pick up and talk about how chemicals move through an ecosystem. So let's take a look at first with energy. We talked in our previous chapters a long time ago that energy for all organisms on the planet, for the most part, comes from the sun. So the energy is going to flow from the sun through producers to consumers. So we're going to look through this step by step. So don't panic. I'm going to just jump right in and we're going to start at the top. So we're going to first stop on our energy chain is we're going to go from the sun to our primary producers. So I talked in the first lecture for this chapter about primary productivity. Well, this is where that term comes from, primary producers. So primary producers are just plants. So plants are going to take that sunlight energy and turn it into food through photosynthesis. So that's our first stop for our energy in an ecosystem. So energy from the sun to plants. Next stop is going to be our primary consumers. You may have also called these guys herbivores. So herbivores are just animals that eat plants. I think this is some sort of little mole, vole. We've never figured out what he is in all the time I've been teaching out of this book. We'll just call him a rodent. So we've got this little rodent. He's going to eat our plants. So now the energy's gone from the sun to the plants to our herbivore, to our primary consumer. Then that little primary consumer is going to get eaten by a secondary consumer, also known as a carnivore. So carnivores are animals that eat herbivores. So in this case, we've got our little snake. And so that snake is going to come along, eat our little rodent, and the energy is going to get transferred. Now, in a lot of ecosystems, we're going to have sometimes a fourth level, and that is what we call tertiary consumers, third level consumers, and these would be our top carnivores. These are carnivores that eat carnivores. We usually don't go much farther than this, and we'll talk about why that is here in a little bit. But in this case, we've got our hawk. Our hawk is going to come down and eat that snake, and then we're at the end. Now, the thing is that energy is a one-way street in ecosystems. So energy is only going to go one way. We can't pass the energy from, say, a hawk to a primary consumer like the rodent. So that's why we often will just say that energy flows. It's like a river. It only flows one direction. All right, so that is our intro on energy. So we've got from the sun to a primary producer like a plant like grass. Then that energy gets passed to our herbivore, then to our carnivore, then to our top carnivore. So then the question is, do ecosystems really work that way? So do ecosystems look like this? You know, is it always just grass to rodent to snake to hawk? All right, and so do snakes only eat rodents? And the answer is of course not. So what we've been looking at is what we call a food chain. So this is a single pathway from our photosynthetic producers, our plants, through the various levels of animals. But that's not the only option that you have, right? So snakes don't just eat rodents. Snakes also eat, Grasshoppers, depending on the species, they might eat more than one type of rodent. They might eat more than that little vole mole guy. They might eat different, like mice and so forth. So what we have instead when we often talk about the energy moving through an ecosystem is a food web. And this is going to involve harvesting energy from multiple stops on the food chain. So you can actually have organisms that eat from multiple places on the food chain. And an organism that does this we call an omnivore. So an omnivore is an organism that has more than one position on a food chain. So, for example, humans actually eat from more than one place on a food chain. So you eat both plants and herbivores. So you eat plants and you also eat cow, probably. Cow is an herbivore, but you might also eat carnivores. So an example like of a carnivore would be sharks. Sharks are actually considered a top carnivore. A lot of fish are actually regular carnivores. So if you eat perch or I can't think of another one off the bass. Those guys are considered carnivores, depending on what kind they are. They may even be top carnivores. So we're eating from multiple places along a food chain, and so we actually are considered omnivores, and we don't actually have a place on a regular food chain like we just saw. And so this is what requires a food web. A food web will allow us to put in organisms like omnivores into that whole set, so we can point at, okay, humans actually eat these guys and these guys and these guys. All right, so let's take a look at the food web that includes the food chain that we just saw. So here's our food chain: grass to the rodent, to the snake, to the hawk. Sorry. So there's grass to the rodent, to the snake, to the hawk. But you can see that now that we have it in a food web, it's not as simple as that, because you can also go grass to rodent straight to the hawk. You also can go grass to grasshopper to chipmunk to hawk. So you get multiple pathways. Now you've got the chipmunk that can be eaten by the snake. And so these food webs are actually a better representation, because it shows us that there are multiple pathways for these interactions to happen. So let's take a look at a more typical food web. So this is a little more typical of a food web, a lot more interactions going on. They've only got a couple of plants because this is a savanna. So savanna, just one main type of tree. They've got two types of grass. There's usually probably more than two types of grass. But to make this one a little easier to follow, they just put in the two. And the thing is with food webs or food chains, the arrows always point towards where the energy is going. So, for example, producers always have arrows pointing away from them. So the primary producers, the plants, always have arrows pointing away. So you can see, for example, this stargrass is going to be eaten by these harvester ants, but also by gazelles. And over here, it's going to be eaten by warthogs, and one more all the way over to this hare, which is a type of rabbit. So the oat grass has lots of them. The acacia, in this case, is only being eaten by this impala. Then once you get farther up, it gets more complicated, and it gets a little harder to trace. You have to follow the arrows all the way up. So for example, this wildebeest is actually being consumed, if you follow this arrow, by the serval, but also by the tawny eagle. So you have to follow the lines, and the lines will point towards who is doing the eating. So the arrow always points to who is doing the eating, that's who's getting the energy. In this case, I don't think on this, yeah, on this food web, there are no omnivores. Because if there was an omnivore, it would have arrows pointing, for example, like the ant would have an arrow pointing from a plant, but then also an arrow pointing from, for example, like this topi, from an animal to it. But there are no, there's nobody on here I see that has arrows going in those directions. The lab that you're going to be doing on the community ecology lab has you building one of these. So when you do that, make sure that your arrows are pointing the right direction. So it's going to point from the organism that's being eaten to the organism doing the eating. So we point the arrows towards the organism that's doing the eating. The other thing that is missing on those food webs are these guys. Decomposers are missing because if we put them on here, this food web would get crazy because every single organism on this food web would have an arrow pointing to the decomposers and to these detritivores. These guys are recyclers. So decomposers would be things like mold, but also our bacteria. These guys are going to be breaking down things that are dead. So they're going to break down the dead stuff, but also they'll break down waste. So, you know, feces and so forth. And the same thing is true for detritivores. So they break down decomposing matter as well. They generally, we think of the detritivores as breaking down bigger stuff. But these guys are going to break down that decomposing material and release chemicals, not food, but chemicals like nitrogen and phosphorus for plants to be able to use to make more food for everybody else in the food web. So these guys, the arrows then don't go back to the plants, but they're helping give nutrients to those plants so that they're able to do their photosynthesis to make more food for everybody else. So let's talk a little bit about why we don't see a lot of those tertiary or more like quaternary and so on up on the food chain food webs. So think about the big fierce animal species in the world. Things like bears, lions, sharks, tigers. They don't have huge populations. There aren't large numbers of these guys running around on the planet. So why are they so rare? Well, it has to do with this energy flow. Every time you go a step in the food chain, you're going to lose energy. Okay? And this goes way back to when we talked about the energy transfers in the energy chapter. When you transfer energy from one place to another, it's inefficient. It does not transfer everything. Some of it gets lost. And so what we call this is the 10% rule, meaning that only 10% approximately of the energy gets transferred from one organism to the other, as far as being able to be used, to actually grow the organism. So where does the rest go? Where does the other 90% end up? Well, it's going to be lost as heat, as the material is broken down, via cellular respiration, and you lose a lot of it as feces, because a good amount of the material just doesn't get digested. So let's take a look at how this works. So, for example, you have all these plants here. If all these plants get eaten by our little mole guy, only 10% of that gets turned into little moles. Those little moles get eaten by snakes. Only 10% of it gets turned into snakes, even though they all get eaten. And then there are snakes. All the snakes get eaten, but only 10% of it gets turned into hawks. And so eventually you run out of energy once you get up this high. You can see that the energy just gets smaller and smaller and smaller until you get up to this top of the pyramid. And so this is why we don't have huge numbers of high level predators in the environment.